Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final of our art talks here at the Lesley MFA in Visual Arts January 2021 residency. I'm the director of the program, Ben Sloat. I want to remind everyone to keep their mics muted and video off during the talk. During the Q&A, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll call on you. We start our public programs with a land acknowledgement. Lesley University here in Cambridge resides on the ancestral and unceded lands of Massachusetts peoples, whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. We pay respect to the Massachusetts peoples and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land for generations. We offer our appreciation to the lands and waters for sustaining us. Our general thematic for this residency is transformation in crisis, which considers various artistic methodologies and responses to times of uncertainty and upheaval. Our public programs began Sunday with a faculty program led by MFA faculty Alex Jackson, in conversation with Gerald Sheffield II and Jordan Seabrook, continuing Monday with the mixed media performance-based artist Rebecca Belmore, Tuesday with visiting faculty Nikita Gale, Wednesday with curator and scholar Ruth Erickson, and yesterday with the mixed media painter Eric N. Mack. Many of those talks are available on our YouTube page in case you missed the live version. Today's speaker, Doris Salcedo, makes sculptures and installations that function as political and mental archaeology, using domestic materials charged with significance and suffused with meanings accumulated over years of use in everyday life. Salcedo often takes specific historical events as her point of departure, conveying burdens and conflicts with precise and economical means. Salcedo's work gives form to pain, trauma, and loss, while creating space for individual and collective mourning. Much of her work deals with the fact that while the death of a loved one can be mourned, their disappearance leaves an unbearable emptiness. Solo exhibitions of hers include those at the New Museum, New York, SFMOMA, Tate Britain, White Cube London, Tate Modern London. Incidentally, we want to acknowledge Susanna Hyman at White Cube for her great help in putting tonight's events together. Thank you, Susanna. Doris's installation, Pledgaria Muda, has traveled to museums throughout Europe and South and North America, including MUAC, Mexico City, Moderna, Museet, Malmö, CAM, Gulbenkian, Lisbon, MAXXI, Rome, Pinacoteca, Sao Paulo, MOCA, Chicago, the Guggenheim Museum, New York, and Harvard Art Museums here in Cambridge. A 2017 lecture from the Harvard Art Museum, Shadows of the Absent Body by Judith Butler, on Doris Salcedo and grievability is posted to the front page of our website, lesleymfa.org. Salcedo was born in Bogota, Colombia, where she currently lives and works. Please join me in welcoming Doris Salcedo.
Thank you. Thank you for such warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my work and for thinking of my work. Tonight, I will present some images of the work I have made in the past 35 years. There will be no time to address all of my work in detail. Therefore, I will only talk about a few of them. If there are any questions about the pieces I'm not talking about today, I could answer these questions at the end of the talk. I find it particularly difficult to talk about art. Images are difficult to translate into words. For that reason, I need to incorporate a number of quotations of poets and philosophers who have oriented my thinking and shaped my work throughout all these years. My solitary work as an artist is also a collective endeavor. The testimony of a victim of political violence is a requirement for the very existence of each and every one of my works. The first step I take in the making of a piece is to orient myself toward the person for whom I will make the piece, the subject of political violence. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas asserts that the work of cultural signification starts as a radical separation from indifference. And this is precisely what I try to achieve with my work. In it, I acknowledge the fact that life precedes art. My work affirms the anteriority of the existence of the victim. And it is an attempt to be faithful to the testimonies generously given to me by many victims of political violence. For Levinas, the person who has been forced into the condition of a victim should be a collaborator and an interlocutor of the artistic production, because the victim is, as he said, quote, the one to whom I express what I express. He is primordially sense and intelligibility, because he lends his experience to my expression, unquote. My work is about those who have been excluded from the human genre, those who, as Levinas wrote, have nothing but the vulnerability of their own skin, or, as the poet Paul Celan put it, those who are unprotected even by the traditional tent of the sky. In my work, I have addressed only one issue: political violence. I have focused on political violence not simply because I am Colombian, which in a way gives me a deeper and closer knowledge of its effects, but because I strongly believe violence defines the ethos of our contemporary societies. Thus, my work does not come from Colombia only. It derives from turmoil and civil war, and civil war, as Hannah Arendt wrote in 1963, is raging all over the earth. My work could come from any of the many places where extreme violence goes rampant. It comes from where we find the trace of the tragic, where it is difficult to distinguish between war and peace, where the difference between soldiers and civilians has been effaced, has been obliterated. Giorgio Agamben thinks, quote, civil war marks a threshold of indifference where the political and the unpolitical, the outside and the inside collide, unquote. And this situation is no longer restricted to places defined as third world. The 21st century civil war is a war whose battlefront has disappeared. Now we find the front everywhere, and the attack can come from anyone. Death strikes at random, as it did at Capitol Hill last week, or as it did at Sandy Hook Elementary School, or at a Charleston church, or in a small town in Colombia, or at a Pakistani park. Acts of war takes place in the Texan tent cities where migrant children are walking in the middle of the night to be transferred to a different camp, or at migrant detention centers where several children have died, or in the waiting zones in Mexico where migrants endure unspeakable violence. Undeclared civil war acquires different forms in different places, but the common element in all of them, as Agamben explained, is the fact that life as such has become the stake of politics. So it is from this negative perspective that I have produced all of my work, driven by the obsessive need to render visible the experience of the most vulnerable and most anonymous victims of political violence. This negative perspective has confined my work within the limits of a wound that remains open. It is precisely within the boundaries of this caesura that I have made every one of my pieces, as a frail attempt to think through creative act all that has been forsaken by pragmatic, economic, and political policies. But in order to think about violence, it is not enough to contemplate reality. One must commit oneself to it, or, as Levinas wrote, quote, to be engulfed by that which one thinks, to be involved. This is the dramatic event of being in the world, unquote. Or, as the writer Gustave Flaubert wrote with his uncanny precision, quote, with my burned hand, I write on the nature of fire, unquote. It is for this reason that From very early on, I have followed Gilles Deleuze's belief that an artist must be forced into an exercise of depersonalization in order to produce works that are far removed from the autobiographical and strongly connected to a political immediacy. The philosopher Alain Badiou goes even further when he argues that an artist's desire needs to be articulated from the point of view of the location of each individual in relation to a specific traumatic experience. The poet Paul Celan considers a similar idea. In his text, The Meridian, he writes that an artist is he who has forgotten all about himself. And in this manner, art moves with the oblivious self into the uncanny and strange, unquote. But later, on the same text, he argues, quote, only the artist who speaks from an angle of reflection, which is their own existence, their own physical nature, can reach the mystery of an encounter, unquote. My work is based on experiences I have not lived personally. Therefore, my work is made from an unfamiliar, unstable place, simultaneously strange and proper. It is made from an indirect perspective, a place of insufficiency from which a fragmentary, incomplete history is precariously told and retold. The place from which I have to produce my work is extraordinarily portrayed in this poem by Josip Mandelstam that I will read to you. What I am saying now is not being said by me. It's dug from the earth like grains of petrified wheat. In the most precise sense, my work is about experience. Etymologically, the word experience comes from the Latin experiri, which means to test, to prove, and from the Latin periri, which means peril, danger. Also from the Indo-European word per, which means to cross. So experience means crossing through danger. Experience is by definition related to an event that already happened. However, this experience is not my own. It is the experience of those that are in the borders of life, on the edges, on the periphery of life, on the epicenter of catastrophe. I believe that in order not to reduce these experiences to the silence and solitude of the traumatized victim, the singular experience must be inscribed on a memorandum, on a work of art. But the experiences I try to address in my work are not anecdotes. The work is it's not about experiences taken directly from life. It is about the memory of experience, always vanishing. It is the vacuum generated by forgetfulness. My work is an attempt to grasp what is no longer present. The work of art is concerned precisely with that which is not an event. It points toward an event, or as Jean-Luc Nancy wrote, quote, in a work of art, an event and eternity coincide in the intensity of its image, unquote. My work departs from the singularity of a lived experience, but on the way it faces that experience to become what Celan calls, quote, a reminder of what is distant and elsewhere, of what is strange to us, a reminder of the presence of the stranger in our present, in a vain attempt to mitigate intolerance. The events that my work is trying to address are in the process of appearing and disappearing. Therefore, they cannot be fully represented, since they are not fully present. They do not occupy a proper place. The work itself is the only locus where these distant events take place. Palimpsest is a piece that intends to realize art's immemorial task, naming. Our names in order to bring into existence those aspects of reality that our society ignores and keeps in obscurity. Palimpsest is a work of art that names the names of refugees who have drowned on the Mediterranean during the perilous attempt of crossing to Europe. The epic scale of this tragic has imposed on us the anonymity of death. Thousands upon thousands of refugees' deaths are reduced to their utmost insignificance and, as such, inscribed into our normal everyday life. The anonymous victims who have perished at sea have names that we ought to name as a way to mourn their irreparable absence. It is for this reason that I need to inscribe their names in a work of art that we create a unique site where these absences could make themselves present. Palimpsest seeks to actualize the act of naming their names in an attempt to suspend, at least temporarily, the intentional ignorance we uphold towards this terrible yet quotidian death. Naming these victims Naming these victims' names is a way to acknowledging the immensity of the loss suffered, not only by their families, but also by us as a society. The death of each person generates an absence, and each absence requires that we take responsibility for those who are missing, since the only way they can exist is within us. Hans-Jost Frey says that, quote, our relation with them does not end with their death. It lives on as grief. In the face of death, the end of our hope survives as mourning, as a sign of the infinite incompleteness of our relationship with the dead, unquote. Theodor Adorno argues that we have a disturbed relationship with the dead, simultaneously forgotten and embalmed. Their violent death is embalmed in our present, but their memory is systematically effaced from our reality, thus creating what he called a wound in civilization. It is within the boundaries of this wound that I would like to inscribe Palimpsest, a work of art that will mark a specific site of remembrance where acts of mourning could take place, a site in which the lives of those excluded from the human genre could be belatedly included. The piece has a subtle presence, barely visible, and nevertheless occupies the entire gallery space. From the ground emerge drops of water that slowly form the names of the refugees who have perished during the dangerous crossing. The names are formed over and over again with the stubbornness and persistence of a mother's griefs. At every moment, from the ground emanates drop of water that write names in different areas of the space at different tempos. The names appear and disappear, making these names at times readable, at times unreadable. The ground bears traces of names written with sand, names of refugees who drowned before 2010. These are slowly deleted by the writing in water of names of more recent victims, thus forming a palimpsest. The names are presented with the precariousness, lightness, and sadness this experience demands. These names, written with floods of tears, will bring home to us the desolation of the twilight the mourners inhabit, and also the clarity and meaning each name carries for the families. The next piece I'm going to talk about is titled Tabula Rasa. For many years, I continually interview rape victims. During the very first interview, I understood the incommensurable damage inflicted in them. Nonetheless, I remain talking to victims in an attempt to understand how they manage to endure living in a society where rape has been normalized and its devastating effects have been erased from the symbolic order. In my work, I have always addressed political violence. I believe rape is a political crime because it is equivalent to a murder in which the victim remains physically alive, but in the fullest sense of the term, herself has been utterly destroyed. Luis Dutoit argues that, quote, rape is a political crime because the victim loses her voice due to the injury inflicted both in her body and her spirit, unquote. In our gender societies, there are strictly assigned roles to each sex. Males are encouraged and emboldened to take, while females are supposed to be only givers or caretakers. For this reason, I thought tables could be a precise metaphor for how women are seen in our society. I am presenting 5 wooden tables that retain the form of a regular table, but on a closer look, it is evident that something has been deeply altered. The very materiality of the wood has been disrupted, disjoined, and splintered to the point where it is uncertain whether they can perform the function we normally assign to a table, such as eating on it or writing on them. They have become unstable objects. Opposing forces are simultaneously giving shape to these tables. On the one hand, there is the violent gesture that has destroyed them, and on the other, the willful act of meticulous and thorough reconstruction of the tables. Both forces are connected and clearly visible on the surface of these pieces of furniture. They reveal the struggle of the reconstruction of these precarious, almost trembling forms. The essence of these works reside in the tension of the two contradictory gestures. It is as though the pull of opposing forces played endlessly on them. The restoration of each single splinter to its original place is an act of resistance that prevents the deformation of or disintegration of the tables. The splintering of the wood could continue ceaselessly, just as for the victim of rape, the pain and humiliation of the transgression continues indefinitely after the attack. In rape, there is a disjunction of time. The suffering inflicted during the rape is perpetually extended into the present of the victim. For the survivor, the past continuously slips into her present. In tabula rasa, each single fragment of wood has been subjected to a violent act, an occurrence that confuses the time of the original making of the table with the time of its remaking. The present of the piece is unhinged. Rape constitutes a brutal attack from the outside. It is the difference between the self and the other. In rape, the difference between the self and the other is violently obliterated. Tabula rasa exposes the pain that is hidden in the inside is exposed, and its vulnerability becomes part of the outside. Just like the crime of rape, these pieces represent a strangely contained excess. In its surface, each fragment marks a quiet but disturbing unrest that could be reproduced ad infinitum in these finite works. And then only the sadness of losing oneself remains present. The next piece I'm going to talk about is titled Fragmentos. In 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas signed up a peace accord to end a civil war that raged for more than 50 years. In the agreement, it was decided that a monument should be built using the metal of the arms the guerrilla voluntarily gave up. When I received the 37 tons of weapons deposited by the guerrillas in order to build a monument, I thought of the pain, death, and destruction caused with them, and came to the conclusion that it was not possible to monumentalize them. Instead, I decided to do something that will conceptually oppose the very notion of a monument, that is, a counter-monument or a performative monument. I decided not to construct a monument because, as its name indicates, a monument is monumental, therefore hierarchical. It is meant to present a triumphalist vision of the belligerent past of a nation. The main function of a monument is to overpower or to belittle us as individuals before a grandiose and totalitarian version of history. In this historical moment, we lack symbols that can be turned into monuments, capable of grasping our society as a whole. It cannot give a society a unique version of what happened to us during this long conflict. However, a fragmented and heterogeneous society like the Colombian one can try to unite its diverging experiences and memories in a common space. I decided to build a space entitled Fragmentos, a space for contemporary art and memory, whose floor or foundation is literally made up of weapons handed over by the guerrilla. These weapons were melted down and reconfigured as the physical and conceptual support on which this site of memory is erected. Standing on this floor, everyone will find themselves in an equitable, stable, and free position from which it is possible to remember and hopefully difficult to forget the legacy of war. I invited a group of women who were raped by armed men to give shape to the weapons. For days, we hammered this metal to mark the symbolic end of the power relationship imposed by these arms, allowing the active participation of the survivors of sexual violence in the creation of an artwork and in the formation of a space that commemorates the end of the armed conflict is part of the symbolic compensation that our society owed them. Fragmentos presents only emptiness and absence, because it is precisely through these elements that I can establish the absolute, irredeemable character of war. Art cannot compensate for the horror caused by war with beauty. And for this reason, Fragmentos does not try to give an aesthetic form to loss, damage, and violent death. In order for the experience of a victim to be understood, it is in all its gravity. This experience must be expressed, narrated, and shared. Fragmentos, the site for memory, has as its mission to produce and exhibit during a period equivalent to the duration of the conflict different works of art that expand upon the memory of war. Each year, an artist will be invited to present his or her work, his or her own view of the war and interpretation of the recent past in this space. We will not have only one monument, but multiple counter monuments that will be changing, polyphonic, and alive. Fragmentos reclaims a memory that is in permanent state of transformation. Art is one of the forms of thought that has the capacity to transform memory into an infinitely inconclusive process. Art allowed us to think about a vision of the future in which opposites live together and the incompatible coexist peacefully. As I said before, the Colombian government and the guerrillas signed a peace accord, but this peace accord had to be ratified through a referendum that took place on October 2nd, 2016. Sadly, small majority voted against peace. I made this work on October 11th as a response to this appalling loss. It was a way to mourn the damage inflicted on the hopes of a vast number of Colombians that wanted to achieve stable and lasting peace. I gathered the name of 0.7% of the more than 250,000 victims produced during 53 years of war. I made an open invitation to the public to write with ashes these forgotten names on white shrouds that were to be stitched together in order to create a huge shroud that could cover the entirety of Bogota's main square, which is the political heart of the city. About 10,000 people participated in the making of Sumando Ausencias. Experiencing reality from a place where violent events take place with awful regularity does not allow one to establish mass distance. Every event is a vivid moment, charged with tension and contradictions. I felt the need to respond straight away with a piece that took only 4 days in the making. I needed to bring the names of the forgotten victims into the present as a way to allow the defeated ones to tell the story of their absence, precisely in the place where the living make their political demonstrations. Walter Benjamin taught us that the past is not something given, it is something we must construct and reconstruct in the present. Viewing the past from the present allows a forgotten or repressed meaning to crop up as an image. Benjamin writes that, quote, "The true picture of the past flies by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and it is never seen again. For every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns, risk the danger of disappearing irretrievably," unquote. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to, as Benjamin says, to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The danger Benjamin is referring to is the danger of oblivion, as we know well the experience of the victims are relentlessly thrown into obscurity. Each victim of violence has a name that we ought to name. In this piece, Sumando Ausencias, we present these names. But we think that the only name available for the great majority of people is excluded. Excluded is the name of those who do not have a name. For him, philosophy, and I would like to add, art, has no other legitimate aim than to help find the new names that will bring into existence the unknown void that is only waiting for us. As soon as I name a dead person in my work, a subtle, impossible presence becomes almost possible, becomes a presence in our world. The next work I'll talk about is titled A Flor de Piel. In my work, I have tried to inscribe violent death without ever repeating or reproducing the violent act itself, but rather responding with images that differ essentially from it, because I think it is important to generate images that oppose the symbolic hegemony violence imposes on us. To find the limit of representation of violence has been an essential part of my work. The question is how to present violence in a work of art without violence. How can I generate images that do not reproduce the violent act while addressing it? Jorge Luis Borges has given me a possible answer. He writes that quote, the immanence of a revelation that does not take about is perhaps the aesthetic fact, unquote. Borges' definition of art allowed us to conceive of ways to present in art violence without violence. This consists precisely in the revelation not taking place, in its remaining imminent. This type of images is the opposite of violence, which reveals completely. Violence is hyper-representation, as Hollywood and authoritarian regimes all over the world know very well. Marie-José Monsen says that the great sites of vision in Western art harbored a concept of the image that demands a void at the heart of this visibility. What makes a work of art is that epiphany in absence that only occurred during an eclipse. For her, the image a work of art presents should be like an eclipse. Quote, what is an eclipse? An object comes between the viewer and the sun and darkens the world of empirical forms while its outline is illuminated by the fire it hides, but whose brilliance we are momentarily able to contemplate, unquote. This brilliance that we are momentarily able to contemplate is the only image art can give. For her, the sense a work of art presents is a sense eclipsed, and the image should be an eclipsed image. Jean-Luc Nancy establishes a difference between being there in the world and being image. The image a work of art presents, quote, is not there, but over there in a distance, and this distance is called absence, unquote. I have tried to inscribe my work precisely in the threshold where the absence of a victim of violence makes itself present. In spite of the fact that I am a sculptor working with solid matter, I perceive the fragile threshold as something untouchable, like an image or a wound. A Flor de Piel started with the simple intention of making a flower offering to a victim of torture in an attempt to perform the funerary ritual that was denied to her. The genesis of A Flor de Piel arose when I began to wonder, how can I initiate even the slightest movement toward a tormented body, if only to present my flower offering? At this point, I began looking for the most fragile way of touching the untouchable. The process of making this piece pushed me to find the limits of the fragile and the most delicate within the frame of sculpture. The elaboration of A Flor de Piel represented a difficult challenge, trying to maintain a rose petal in a stage that is neither dead nor alive. I treated them so they remain suspended between the reign of the animate and the inanimate. I needed a shroud made out of rose petals that are simply sutured to one another. To me, making this piece represented the unattainable aim to shroud the extension of bodies torn away from life and never properly delivered to death. This is a delicate and almost insubstantial piece. In a certain way, what defines this piece is our gaze, our relationship with it. It is a thin shroud, an interface that makes possible the idea of coming close to touching while making evident the impossibility of a caress, of healing, and of saving from the abyss of death. Violent death lays beyond the scope of art. Monsen writes that death cannot be represented in art because it is the ultimate profanity and as such escape all symbolization. Death is not representable, and for this reason in art, quote, it is substituted not by the category of emptiness, but of hollowing out, unquote. Its content, argues Monsen, should be emptied out to allow it to appear anew in the time and space of the sacred. Perhaps what art could do is pronounce the death of death. And this is precisely what I hope to attain with the next piece I will present tonight, Pledgaria Muda. Our society generates margins and exclusions in which it places the part of the population that in the eyes of the administrative power are perceived as surplus, redundant population. This population is forced to dwell not only in the periphery of the cities, but on the periphery of life itself. They inhabit the most external border of humanity, and there they remain displaced from the human genre. The process of investigating this work began in 2004 with a trip around Southeast LA, where I found an official report which stated that over 10,000 young people had suffered violent deaths on the streets of the city over a 20-year period. I focused my attention on the violence caused by gangs and particularly on the murky relationship that is established between the role of the victim and the role of the killer. After reflecting on this, I realized that this perverse and fluid swap between roles was possible because both inhabit an undefined gray area, which some writers have called social death or death in life. Social death is experienced by people living in deprived areas under precarious conditions. Its consequences are tragic. One can easily see the connection that exists between the so-called social death and the subsequent violent, anonymous physical death. The conditions that generate this social death are quite similar all over the world, whether in LA or in Bogota. Pledgaria Muda then is a response also to a particular event that took place in Colombia between 2003 and 2009, in which more than 5,000 young people from deprived areas were murdered by the Colombian army and then presented as unidentified guerrillas discharged in combat. The death of each young person generates an absence that demands that we take responsibility for those who are missing, since the only way they can exist, as I said before, is within us. Our relation with them does not end with their death. It lives on as grief. Colombia has been the country of the unburied dead. We have hundreds of unidentified mass graves where the dead remain nameless. For this reason, I needed to inscribe the image of the grave in this piece, creating a memorial, a graveyard, in which to open up a space for each body. Pledgaria Muda highlights each tomb individually. Despite not being marked with a name, each piece has been sealed and has an individual character, as if to indicate that a funerary ritual has taken place. The implacable and obsessive repetition of the tomb emphasize the painful repetition of this unnecessary death. I hope that in spite of everything, life might prevail even in difficult conditions, as it does in Pledgaria Muda. The next piece I'll talk about is titled Abyss. Space is a fundamental category for any form of power. Architecture represents its potency, its social order, and its objective. Architecture of power is made explicit in this room at the Castello de Rivoli. I thought this room had an absolute and totalitarian character. The piece I installed in it emphasized both the form and the character of this grand space. It was clearly a space of political practice, and this remains evident today, more than a century and a half after it ceased to be a center of power. Abyss is a tool to decode the history and nature of this impressive and at times unapproachable space. This space is the result of a long-term research on contemporary slave work and on the social conditions that allowed and encouraged its existence. At least There are 30 million people forced into contemporary slave work. Most of the slaves are migrants. The rejection of the immigrant as a human being and the erasure of their status as political refugees or even as workers encourage the unstoppable progress of human trafficking. Abyss addresses the sheer extra way the powerful ones exert over disenfranchised populations. By simply building a continuation of the brick dome downwards and then stopping just before the space becomes totally entombed. We know the worst moment of history had been defined by racial hatred. The rejection of the migrant marks the trend towards separation, disintegration, and racism. And this is the space Shibboleth, the next piece I'll talk about, intend to delineate. Shibboleth, whose charge has always been to determine who can cross and who should die in the attempt, is placed here to mark the unbridgeable gap that separates humanity from infrahumanity. Shibboleth addresses the part of humankind that has been left out of the history of modernity and kept at the margin of high Western culture. The piece is about the absolute indifference, no cultural ornament, and attenuates the desolation and destitution it is addressing. This piece is inopportune and apparently out of control. It intrudes in the turbine hall. Its occurrence seems to be the product of an irrational event crossing through a rationalist building. Its appearance disturbs the museum in the same manner the appearance of migrants disturbed the consensus and homogeneity of European society. Immigrants are widely perceived as the sole vector of decadence capable of jeopardizing the historical and cultural heritage that gave shape to Europe's identity. The immigrant is not welcome. Emmanuel Levinas has changed the Cartesian dictum, I think, therefore I exist, for I dwell, therefore I exist. To dwell is to exist. And he goes even farther. For him to dwell is to be in a place where one is welcomed. I wanted to address this issue from the perspective of art, analyzing the role art played in the formation of the stereotype of human beauty. Western art constructed a radiant image of whites against the erased figure of all other peoples. Non-whites are faceless, and those faceless people have through centuries been those who must be hated and therefore assassinated. Levinas says that, quote, the totality of being, where being shines for a signification, is not an entity fixed for eternity. It requires arrangement and collection. It requires the cultural act of man, of artists capable of thinking across and beyond disaster. In spite of the fact that the pieces I have shown tonight are quite different from one another, there is one element that remains constant in all of them: unwavering faith in art's ability to affirm the necessity of not remaining silent, even when addressing what Mikevan calls those issues of which one cannot speak. The making of my work is like a solitary liturgy where the unbearable, the unknowable, and the impossible are accepted and forged into image capable of generating the yes, yes with which Derrida defines faith. For him, faith is a general affirmation by which, quote, we all respond to the language before language, which must be repeated from moment to give us a reason to live on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doris. Can we all unmute and give her a round of applause? Thank you. So if folks have questions, please put them in the chat. And Doris, I just wanted to start off with, I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to start off with two. And one is, here in the US, we are almost in a state of repressed mourning. Like the COVID deaths are approaching 400,000, yet there's very little, ritual, there's very little sort of acknowledgement of that. And so these deaths just sort of hover, they become suspended, but yet your sort of embrace and this kind of perpetual mourning and grief, I just wonder how you tolerate that state.
It's not easy. It is difficult, but it's an essential part of being human. If we do not mourn, we lose our humanity. Jean-Marie, a survivor of Auschwitz, he said that the aesthetic value we give to death, to the rituals of death, define the ethics that we gave to life. So if we are not mourning with rituals, then we are losing our humanity. We are devaluing life itself. So it is very important. Of course, in the present, because of the turmoil, of the political turmoil, because of everything that is happening in politics, and because the pandemic has been so harsh on all of us, it seems like we haven't had time to mourn. But I think it is the task of art to ritualize all this death. And I think we ought to do it. We cannot simply just move ahead without doing it. We cannot do it. We need to value life, each single life, the life of every person who has died. In most cases, I think unnecessarily, because many deaths could have been prevented. They need to be acknowledged. We need to honor them. And we deeply, deeply, deeply have to make these rituals. And I think this is one of art's main tasks. And as artists, I think we can give to the society certain tools to perform these rituals. Otherwise, as I said before, we lose our humanity.
And how do you, there's also a kind of element of magic in your work that, when you come, like you cannot believe to see the scene. Like if you look at, the Tate Modern has this incredible crack in the bottom, and it just seemed like it was always there. It just sort of appeared, overnight, which is also true with the rose. And the first work of yours I've ever saw was, I don't speak Spanish, so I didn't want to say the title, but the shoes in the wall. And like, how do these shoes, there's almost this kind of magical quality of otherworldliness that has come on. And I was wondering if you could address that part as well.
Well, I think I think of a sculpture almost as a painter, because the surface of the work, I think it is essential. I think in life we have gotten out of touch with pain, and I wish the sense of touch could be reinserted through my work, and then get in touch with life again, with suffering. So the surface, it is essential, and I think this delicate treatment is what gives this work is essential element. I am visually impaired. I'm legally blind, and so I perceive the world in a different manner. I think seeing is usually a way of exerting power. The powerful ones always live in the higher apartments, and since the Middle Ages, it has always been like that. And I think for me, going into detail, into little tiny insignificant detail, a detail that is repetitive. It's very important because these little details, I hope they almost bring the presence of the absent ones into our present tense. And so all the delicate work, the delicate detail, it is an essential part of the piece. Since I am honoring lives that have been lost in political violence, I think these lives should be honored with utmost respect and delicacy and devotion. So the work should have all these elements. It is the respect for that life. It is the beauty. It is the essence of the life what must shine forth.
Thank you. I'm looking in the chat. There's a question from James Porter.
Thank you so much, Doris. It was a really profound talk and so incredible to see your images. I noticed that collaboration seems to play a central role in your work, both at the outset in conversations with victims and also in the making of the work. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
It's something that that has developed with time. At the beginning, I began working alone. Then I realized it was not enough. Then I didn't want to talk about myself. I needed to open up and try to find the experience of the other, of the person I was addressing. And so I started traveling around Colombia, and wherever there was a massacre or something terrible happened, I would travel to this area and talk to survivors. And then I realized I learned so much from them, and that I decided that I had to be obedient to whatever they had to say. So my work started changing, and as in some cases I use objects that were given to me by the victims, objects that or they represent words that were clearly repeated or clearly stated in the testimonies. And I, little by little, I start, I don't know exactly how to express this, but I managed to put the center of this person who I was talking to in my center, and somehow put my center outside myself. It's kind of a schizophrenic game, but it happened, and it really happens. And when I'm working, I'm into the role of that person. Then I start expanding that experience, and while I was making works that refer to terrible events that affect the Colombian society, and events that, as I say in the talk, I felt I had to respond very quickly. So I go to the main square in Bogota. I show images of some candles in the main square. I brought 24,000 candles to the main square. It was clear that I was going to be unable to place 24,000 candles and unable to light them, because I had to kneel down and light each one of them. And somehow the Colombian society was in such pain at that moment, because the guerrilla had murdered 11 congressmen that had been kidnapped for 6 years. People were so offended and so much in pain that thousands of people came out and they helped me. Then I realized the possibility of making these collective processes. Then, as I say in the talk, when we lost the referendum for peace, I make a call to the public, and it was beautiful to see the public reaction to the piece. I wanted a piece that was absolutely white in the middle of a filthy city like Bogota. Bogota is filthy and disorganized and chaotic, and so it was a hard thing to propose, and it is unsafe as well. And somehow people will get into the square, take off their shoes, leave their bags far away, unprotected, and start working. It was the most beautiful act. And I think people are willing and in great need to this kind of events. I'm sure, because of what had happened, not only with the pandemic, but in political terms in the US. I am sure if there is a proposal to make a peaceful, beautiful, meaningful peace, people will come out. There is a need for that in this very moment. Because as political events are invading our daily life in such a radical way, we are being forced to be more political. Usually the global South, who have gone through traumatic events, are more political. Here in the South, we understand that if a person is unemployed, it's not because the person is useless, but because there is a social problem. I think now it's going to start happening in the global North because the situation is so radical. So I think that now it's a perfect timing for political, public, collective pieces. I think people will respond beautiful to them.
I see a question first from Oliver, then from Peter.
Hi, Doris. Thank you so much. Really beautiful talk.
Right.
Some years ago, I went to a concentration camp in Austria, to Mauthausen, and was struck, and I don't know why I was struck, it should seem obvious, but was struck by just how powerful the physical space was, the ghosts that were there. There was a lot of art there, a lot of sculpture, and that was very nice too, as a kind of represented various countries and various peoples that had been killed there. But it was really just the space itself. And in listening to you talk, I became sort of aware of how important physical space is, and yet so much of what I associate with memorializing and memory, and oftentimes grief, also is embodied in photography in my life and in contemporary culture. I was wondering if you could, if you've thought about the place of the photograph in relation to your work or your interests, and maybe if you could reflect on that a bit.
I have not reflected on that much. The only thing the only relation I have with photography is that when I make pieces that are ephemeral, of course, what remains is the document. The document is always there, it's always present. But I am truly a sculptor. I relate to materiality, to space. So for me, it's more difficult to relate to photography. But I think but we can there is a need for certain type of photography that could be able to bring to us the absence, the solitude, the silence, the pain, without depicting it so obviously as some photography does. So there is a lot of work to be done on that sense, that we need to create these kind of images, this sensibility for images that allowed us some space for thinking, for remembering, images that do not impose on us what they represent. So I think not only in sculpture but also photography, I think silence is very important. There is always because at this time we cannot impose one single point of view. So every work, either photography or sculpture, should be open enough for the images, ideas, feelings of the viewer to be in a dialogue with us. So now that we have so many demagogues saying terrible things permanently and such an invasion of images, I think that there is a wonderful moment and great need to present this kind of images, this kind of photography that allows us to think and to reflect, and that does not give us one single point of view, but allows for a multiple point of view. But I haven't reflected much on photography, to be honest, not much.
I think one of the things I just forgot to mention there in the sort of the segue into my question about photography was that when I went to Mauthausen, to the concentration camp, I brought my camera, but couldn't take any pictures.
Of course.
It seemed like it immediately became apparent that it's not something that could be photographed.
Yeah, absolutely. It is immoral. Yeah, I agree with you.
We have a question from Peter, then from Holly.
Yes. Hi, Doris. Thank you so much for the amazing talk. I was curious to know, I guess, about your approach in terms of contouring the work to public or gallery space, and that, how that influences your thinking. And I guess, the background of the question is that it feels that the appeal of the work is so universal. And the gallery space feels sort of inherently constrained in terms of the demographics of the art audience. And so I'm wondering, I guess, how you negotiate that, and how how you toggle between these different frequencies as you move about from very, very open public projects and then things that are meant for, again, like a gallery and museum setting.
Well, it is in a way, for me, it is the same.
Okay.
Because my commitment, my true commitment is toward the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And that commitment expresses itself in several ways. When it is in the public space, it's an event. I do it because it's an event that imposes itself on our reality. But I have a lot of respect for gallery spaces as well. It's not that I have a priority, that I prefer one over the other. They are just different, because I think the intimate relation between the viewer and the work is an essential part of the work. And I don't see that art is elitist and that only certain population go to galleries or museums, because I think the images tend to last. Art is not something, it's not like a newspaper, it's not a one-day thing. Art should be able to connect to many people in many places in different times. So I always think of that, whether the piece itself remains as a sculpture or whether it remains as a photograph, as a documentation of the event that took place. The important point is that the viewer can connect with the pain that is inscribed in the work, because all of us, rich, poor, in the global north or in the global south, we all have memories of pain, deeply inscribed, physical and emotional pain. There's no human being who hasn't experienced that. So the possibility of connecting with the life that has been destroyed, it's always there, whether in the public space or in the private gallery space, but it's always there. And the important thing is that it happens. I'm not interested. I never think of whether the piece is going to be seen by one person or by 3 million people. I don't see the difference. The only thing that is important is that the connections occur. And if it occurred only with one person, I'm more than happy. Because it truly, I think then it gave something to that person. And as it gives something to the person, the life of the victim that was destroyed somehow continues in the viewer that saw that piece and that was moved or hopefully touched by it. So it is the same.
Thank you.
Holly, you have a question?
Yeah, so many. I guess my main, two things. I also share this desire to make images that contemplate the sort of shattered, that social death that you talked about, and to do so without repeating more violence, but I struggle with representations of rage and this idea, or in your work, the way you facilitated the women to beat the metal sheets was so profound. And I'm really thinking too about this issue of silence versus like the issue of the scream, and how silence and the monumental allow like a different kind of construction of a new symbolic order than maybe a revolt or a scream does. And I just wondered what you thought about rage and if you had contemplated rage in that silence.
I do contemplate rage. I live in rage. I hate this world. I think it's disgusting. I hate every minute of it. I hate poverty. I hate hunger. I hate sickness. I hate violence. I hate demagogues. I hate politicians. There are so many. Of course, I live in rage, but that rage has to be contained.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about pictorial space and painterly space as a way to allow that distance that you were also talking about to be a facilitator, at that container to be a facilitator.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I don't think that I have that my rage is important.
Yeah.
So I try to silence myself and let other narrative take over. And it is amazing how when you talk to victims of violence, they are sometimes sad, but not always enraged, because they don't want vengeance. They don't want revenge. So it's a feeling that is different. And I think in art we have to show the whole thing. Yes, there is rage, but also there is love, and also there is tenderness, and also there is beauty, and you have to have a more complex approach. Right. So it is this complete approach what will make a work of art art. Otherwise, it would be, I don't know, propaganda. It would be like a tweet, and that's not the idea. We have to show a much more complex idea. That's where I think for us, reading poetry is very important. Reading philosophy and reading poetry will help us to temper that rage.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it.
That's amazing. I have a question on behalf of our Dean, Amy Dynas, who's a architect. So her question is if you can talk about how gender and feminism has played a role in your work. And she relates to her business partner who's based in Bosnia and has gone through 2 wars, but is not even 40. And those wars have defined her as an architect and as a person. And so wondering if, how your work reflects on wider global conditions and issues of feminism, and hoping that your work is empowering the women in our audience.
Well, of course, all of my work is made from my perspective. I come from Colombia, and it's not, it's a macho culture. That's why macho is a Spanish word. Yeah, and it has been very difficult for me to establish my work here. And my work in Colombia was only recognized once it was recognized outside the country. Here it was completely ignored. The first time people start talking about my work here was when I made MAXXI, because it was such a big press, it had such a big press impact that it had to be acknowledged. But so here I've been dealing with not only, I think it's more complex, it's just, of course, machism, sexism, but it's also a class issue in Colombia and a race issue. So I happen to be dark skin, I have curly hair, and I don't come from the upper classes. I come from the lower middle class. So all these things intersect to make my life very difficult in Colombia. So every one of my pieces is a statement. It is a statement on feminism. Yes, I'm talking, I have a voice, and we all have voices. And that's why when I had the opportunity to make a permanent monument in Colombia, the first thing that came to my mind is women victims of rape have to make this piece. And this monument is at the very heart of Colombia. It's 1 block away from the Senate, is 1 block away from the president's house. It's at the political heart of Colombia. So I wanted to place women right there at the political center of Colombia. And I've been enjoying myself out of that location, because if there is I don't know, a prime minister or whoever, a president or whoever comes to visit the president's house, who is right-wing, then they go to Fragmentos, and I have the chance to tell my story, because it's only a block away. So I tell my story from the perspectives of the women who have suffered this war. Of course, men have been killed, but women have really taken the hardest part of this war. So it is always from my perspective as a woman that I have worked. That's why there are so many stitches. That's why the work is so delicate. That's why there are a lot of feminine elements in my work. The delicacy with which I treat the surfaces, there's always clothing. There are always items that remind us that we should take care of each other, that care is important. And of course, I'm a feminist, and I'm always aware of the fact that I'm open new terrain for women in the South, in the global South.
Thank you. I see a question from Noelle.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, I got disconnected and then reconnected. First, I wanted to thank you so much. Your work is so incredibly meaningful and profound, and it was just lovely to hear you speak about it. My question is somewhat about your process, which you've already talked about, going to areas in which these traumatic events have occurred and talking to people. But it struck me, for instance, like in your work, A Flor de Piel, just how what is your process, and how did you come to using these petals and sewing them together? And I don't know if people realize that what that means. It means, you know, piel is skin. And so what was that moment like for you? What is this a quiet moment and it occurs to you? Is it, I'm sure it's different each time, but I was wondering if you could speak on that just a little bit.
This piece of Flor de Piel was made as an homage to a nurse that was horribly tortured to death by the right-wing paramilitary that squads in Colombia. And the making of my work, well, starts by researching an event. And then I start working with matter, and it's always a nightmare. And A Flor de Piel was maybe my worst nightmare. No, the second worst nightmare I experienced, because I thought that I wanted to present a flower offering. That was all I wanted to do. And at the time, there was a lot of talk, not only in Colombia, but internationally, about torture. I guess you guys remember during the Bush administration, there was a lot of talk about what is legal in terms of torture and what is enhanced interrogation. And I thought it was so immoral, so absolutely obscene to think that causing pain to another human being could be legal and could be enhanced interrogation. And what does it mean for a society? It was such a horrible moment, really, to be reading this in the New York Times, in the papers, and then experiencing torture in Colombia in the most brutal ways. So I was wondering if a torturer can destroy the skin of a human being, if a torturer can imprint by force his presence on the other person, that is of course unable to respond, unable to defend him or herself, I started thinking of healing. How can I heal that skin that had been disturbed, disturbed, torn apart, destroyed, burned, cut, whatever? And I wanted something delicate, so I started dealing with rose petals, and every time trying to make it more and more and more and more delicate. And it took me literally years to find out the way to treat the petal, until it looked like dried flesh whose skin has been torn away. So that's why it has that dark red color. And it does look like skin, but at the same time, I wanted to stitch. I wanted to be able to perform like a healing, like a social healing, and then build a shroud big enough to cover all the bodies that had been tortured all over the world in the dark sites that the CIA built. That now, because the political situation is so extreme, we have forgotten everything that Rumsfeld did and all these guys. I mean, we cannot forget about that. This is something that has to be there, and we have to talk about torture and how terrible it is. So that's why I needed to make the most delicate piece. I hope that answers your question.
It's just amazing. Thank you so much.
I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but I guess I'll conclude then with one more question. Right before the talk, I was asking about your experience seeing your work interact with the audience, and I was amazed to hear that you're unconcerned with the audience, and your only concern is with the people you're memorializing and grieving for. So do you feel like your role as an artist is just to put the work out into the world? It's so carefully done, but I guess you just take a step back after the work is installed, or what is that experience of seeing the work? Because often we talk about work having its own life and it lives in the public and kind of evolves away from us, but you seem to step away from that.
Well, I make the work for a specific victim, and I'm working for that person. I'm at the service of that person, and that's what counts. Then once the work is made, and it's finished, and I think I feel I have been able to honor the pain and the experience of that person, that's when my work ends. Then I install it in spaces in a way that that experience is more clearly present. The work it's truly ended, not only in my studio, but when I install it in a space. So the lighting is essential, but everything is with the same intention of honoring that experience and showing that the experience of the victim in the more precise manner. It has to be absolutely precise to the last detail. So the placement of a piece has to be perfect and precise. The lighting, the rhythm, the way people traverse the museum and enter into one room or another. Everything has to be precise, and that's it. And then my work is done. I have to move away. I think the beauty of art resides in the fact that you can take it or you can leave it. As public, you go and you look if you want, and if you don't, you don't. And that's the beauty of art, as opposed to advertisement that impose images on you, or even journalism. I think the beauty of art is that it could not be there. Is that subtle presence what makes it poetic? So I don't want to impose anything on the public. It's just there for them to see or not, or to accept or not to accept.
But yet you loved how people participated. I guess that's part of the participation in.
It's different. It's different
Right.
to have a viewer than to have a person collaborating, actively participating. I think I see that as two different things.
Gotcha.
One thing is the way I install my sculptures, and another thing is how we produce our work together.
Mhm.
I don't know. I have been making these huge pieces out of a wild impulse without really thinking of the consequences. In terms of sumando ausencias, the white shrouds that had to be stitched, we have to make, I forgot now, but I think it was something like 9 kilometers of stitches. If I had been in my right set of mind, I would have never even think of it, because the square was given to me only for 12 hours. And I had no clue how many people was going to show up. And somehow people show up and we finish it in 12 hours. So I was able to clear the space when I was supposed to. But those are things that happen. I cannot really express how. It's just you have to be aware of the I don't know how to say it, of the pulse of the society, of the needs of the society at a moment, and then present the work right there when there is a need for the piece to exist.
Great. I see one more question by Holly again in the chat.
Hi, yes. Sorry, I have to ask. I'm really interested in this sort of receding as a way to give voice to someone else. Personally, like I am the victim of sexual trauma, and I'm really interested in this sort of conundrum of like, where is the value in my catharsis for making work? And then how do I produce a space that authentically represents that state of shattering, but facilitates something worthwhile for the viewer? And I wonder, like, how do you see that space, like the contemplation of your own dead body? How do you see that space existing in this sort of acts of collective mourning, of healing, of reparation?
As I said before, I place myself in the role of the victim. So if you are a victim, what happened to you has happened to millions and millions and millions of women in the world. So your experience is tremendously valuable. It is enormously important that a victim has a voice, that you are able to talk. That is extraordinary, because that is exactly what violence attempts to do. Violence attempts to silence the victim. That's why when a horrible thing had happened to a person, when you or somebody else have been abused, then the first thing is crying, is a lament. That's what comes first, before language, because the violent person wants to destroy our ability to articulate and narrate and clearly.
I deeply relate to this type of destruction, and my solution has to be to sort of get really excited about that revolt of meaning, that new symbolic order that can sort of spring forth from that confrontation. And I just wonder about the value of that,
it's enormously valuable. It's your voice what is most important in these times. Unfortunately, for the first time, victims are being heard for the very first time. It didn't happen 10 years ago, but it is happening now. So you have a voice and you have the possibility of saying something that you utterly know. And it is extremely important because it's happening to many more people. I wouldn't as I said before, I don't focus on the viewer. Because if you articulate your experience clearly, somebody will get it. You don't have to worry about that. Somebody will connect with your experience. You have to trust that. And what really counts is that you clearly articulate your feelings your experience, your memories. And you know that those memories are extraordinary. I might say something horrible. I'm going to say something horrible to you. But in a way, having that experience that you had is a privilege. You have to see it as a privilege because you have a stronger voice.
I deeply appreciate you saying that. Don't make me tear up. But thank you.
Well, thank you, Doris. Can we all unmute one more time and give Doris a hand? That was tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Incredibly generous. All right. Well, we will have the YouTube on our page for folks who want to watch it again. And thank you so much, Doris, for I'm just so amazed that Zoom can connect us from different continents. And I'm just so grateful for that. So, all right. Well, good evening, everyone. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Amazing.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Amazing.
You're awake. Look at you.
Oh, it was fantastic. Oh my God, it was so fantastic, Doris.
Oh, you're wonderful. You're so generous.
No, I absolutely loved it. And I could tell everyone was so kind of hyped by it.
Oh, you're so generous. I can't believe you're awake.
Brilliant.
Good.
Oh, yeah, Susanna's in London. So we have 3 continents represented here, which is amazing.
So I was hooked. It was just superb.
Oh, sweet. You're so sweet. You're so sweet.
Oh, it was really, really like, and your last comment to Holly was brilliant. And it's just, it's like, you use this. It's a privilege. Like, actually, you can speak. You find your voice. It was exquisite.
Absolutely. 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 Okay.